If you were watching EastEnders in the 1980s, Den and Angie, I guess, were the two famous faces of EastEnders. But there was one scene in particular that I think it's always rolled out in the sort of like top 100 most famous scenes in soaps and that sort of thing. And it was between Michael Cashman, the actor, and another actor in the series. And it was the first gay kiss on UK television. This was what, I think 1986, Michael, wasn't it? Well,
87.
87. Well, we'll come to EastEnders a little bit later, but welcome to the programme. The reason we're talking to you is because I think today is the day of publication of your autobiography, one of them, From Albert Square to Parliament Square. And when I interview people about their memoirs, sometimes you sort of kind of go through the motions, if I'm honest. I shouldn't be sort of lifting the curtain too much, should I? But I've been absolutely entranced by your book because it is searingly honest. Now, often autobiographies are described as a work of fiction about yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, this, in a way, this could be a novel, couldn't it? Parts of it, certainly.
But parts of it are unbelievable.
What was it? What was the experience of writing it?
Well, Paul, my late husband, used to say to me, "Come on, you've done so much. Write it down." And I didn't really. I took a couple of attempts, but it was when Paul died 5.5 years ago. I wanted to write about us, about me and him, and I realised with the first draft that I'd written about a man who not only walked on water but hovered in the air, and it was completely. It was a eulogy, and I went back and did another draft, and thankfully, very early on, the publishers Bloomsbury took an interest, and I think what I wanted to honestly do was to look back on a life that's been almost unimaginable. I lived back in the East End, very close to where I was born, and the other day when I collected the book, physically collected the finished book from the publishers in Bedford Square, and I put it under my arm, and started to rain, and I went home. I walked along the street where I played as a kid, and I saw the 5-year-old me, and I looked at this book, and I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed because of the journey that he'd gone on and the journey that I've gone on, and also that Paul not being around. You think the things that are absent give you a greater awareness of them than when they're around. And I suppose I wrote it. I wrote it because I wanted to put everything down as honestly as possible. And Bloomsbury were brilliant in guiding me very early on, and then left me alone and didn't buy the book. So that's a very convoluted answer to your question.
But it is an emotional thing, writing a memoir, I think, because it does bring back maybe some very unhappy memories as well as some happy ones. And there's a certain finality to it as well. It's a recognition that you're not 25 anymore.
I get that recognition when I look in the mirror in the morning, and I look in the mirror and I go, "Oh my God, did I sleep with you?" You don't fit the image that I have of myself. No, I get exactly what you mean, but it's because of that finality, the fact that I had to deal with the dark things that happened to me, because unless you do, you're doing a great disservice to the people who've been in your life, let alone your ability to survive despite some of these things. And so that finality, that I think that's probably one of the reasons that I sobbed, that I looked at a life contained in a book that I never thought I would write or would be able to write, and key parts of that journey. So yes, you're dealing with your own mortality and your failures. Although I believe failure for me is an example that somebody attempted to change something and change something for the better. I don't have a negative about failure, but I think if you look back at the things I've done in my life, you'll probably find out why.
Well, let's start off with your upbringing, which was in the East End of London, and I mean, it's really evocative. You were born in 1950, and it's another age, isn't it?
Oh, totally. The concept of more than one channel, first of all, on television, Alien. We had a tiny little black and white television that you had to watch in the dark. And as you were watching it, if somebody else was lucky, they'd have theirs on, or there'd be old Mr. Pittaway upstairs banging away on his piano. There'd be the women out on the communal balconies sharing a fag, chatting away. But it was the energy. Living in the docks, there were ships coming in from all over the world. They were queuing to be unloaded. Horse and carts carrying stuff from all over the world. And we were in the middle of this energy and this noise and this excitement. But a real sense of community. My dad was a docker. And when I was born, like my eldest brother, the first thing he did after getting drunk was went down the port labour board, and put our names down so that we would follow him in the docks. My mum, a proud office cleaner, came from a long line of office cleaners. If she'd had 4 daughters, she would have taken them at the earliest age office cleaning to know what they would do. Now, I think my mum must have known I was gay early on because she took me office cleaning. And she used to say to me, "Come on, Mike, you get the ashtrays, wipe the ashtrays, get the bins, come on, son." And so it was incredible.
But it is interesting. There you talk about effectively inherited jobs. That really doesn't happen in today's society, does it?
Well, strangely, I think to a certain extent it still does, and it's the thing that the upper classes
the farming background,
and the working, yes, but it's something that the working classes and the upper classes have always shared. It was the middle class that were able to shift their aspirations either upwards or elsewhere.
But were you aware at an early age that you weren't going on the docks?
Yes.
Because, I mean, you and I have something in common there, because I grew up on a farm. All my family were farmers on my mother's side and my father's side. I was the eldest son, so it was the expected thing to do to go into farming.
Yeah.
I knew from the age of 5 that was not where I was heading. And luckily, I had parents who came to terms with that and didn't put any pressure on me to take over the family farm.
Well, my parents had no option but to accept it, the way it happened, the amazing change. I knew I was different, and because of what happened to me, that young docker stopping me in the street when I was 7, when I was running home, I can see it so clearly, just on the corner of my mum and dad's pub, the Enterprise. And he said, "Do you want to earn a shilling?" And a shilling? Oh, you could bury yourself in ice cream and Tizer for that.
Tizer.
Yeah. And I didn't realise it's called Tizer because it's an appetizer. Yeah. And he took me down this alleyway and into a warehouse and sexually abused me. And I buried it. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. First of all, you don't have the vocabulary to describe what's happened to you. And you know as a kid that you're told that children should be seen and not heard. And if you cause trouble, you are the trouble. And I think my way of burying it was to become this extrovert that was always putting on shows and pretending to be somebody else, interestingly. And so I think they looked at me, my mum and dad, and thought, where did this one come from? And so when I failed my 11 plus, well, let's put it the other way around. If I passed my 11 plus, I wouldn't be here now. My life would have been completely different. And because I failed, something I didn't even know I was taking.
We have so much in common.
Yeah, really.
I did that. I took the 11 plus, didn't realise what it was and failed it too. And I wouldn't be sitting here now had I passed.
Well, there
that.
you go.
Isn't that weird?
Isn't that we are an amazing example of what somebody else would term having failed at something. You don't. You achieve your unique potential by going on, searching for what you want to do. And I went to this secondary modern school where I describe it in the book as a war zone. We were the enemy and they were prepared for us. And my God, they had an arsenal. And because I knew at that early age that I was gay, that I was, as my mum said, when she saw me dancing, she looked at my aunt and she went, "I think he's one of them." And I knew. I danced on, but inside I froze because I thought, they know.
How old were you?
They know I'm different. I was about 7 or 8.
But you had a concept of what that meant.
I had a concept that I only wanted to be with other boys. I wanted secret friendships with them, and so I saw the girls as that they would be my friends, and we would fancy the boys who were the common enemy, and so when I went to the secondary modern school, aged 11, and I didn't fit in, this rebel didn't fit in, and I discovered the drama class. That's a fancy term for it. And behind this faded red curtain on this assembly stage, on the other side was a world that transported me. That somebody put on from West Side Story, I Want to Be in America. And I was lifted. And I could be eccentric, I could be different. And the drama master said, Cashman, he said, I believe you impersonate the teachers. No, sir, not me. I believe you impersonate Louis Armstrong. Yes, sir. And Eartha Kitt. Yes, sir. And so the end of term school show at Christmas, he announced, I did a song, did Strolling, and then he announced that they had a star all the way from New York, the wonderful, the fabulous Miss Eartha Kitt, and they brought me on the back of a chair. And evidently my mum screamed out, "Here, here, here, he's got my cocktail dress on." And that there was a talent scout at this school in the East End, and within 6 weeks, just after my 12th birthday, I was in Oliver in the West End of London, and later went on to play Oliver. That was why my parents couldn't stop the momentum. It just accelerated.
And that would have been a very unusual path in the early 1960s, wouldn't it?
Oh, incredible. I remember my dad saying, I don't want a son of mine going on a stage, it's full of queers. And inside my head I went, oh, that sounds a nice place to be. Especially as I knew I was attracted. But no, it was another world. Getting on that number 15 bus in Limehouse, travelling, it used to take about an hour. Going through, I describe it, going up Fleet Street where the Beano was printed and all those newspapers, where other families worked. And then the East End of the Strand and the lights of the Savoy, very small on the left-hand side. And I knew I was coming to a world where I belonged, where I could be myself. And again, it wasn't straightforward, because I was entering a world where I could be different, but also where people wanted to abuse your difference. And that's where I came across a man who convinced my parents that I should be in his charge for a short while, and I would stay with his wife and his children overnight. And when I got there, it was a boarding house, and there was no wife, there was no children, and he passed me off as his son. And I was introduced into an adult world that was full of lies that I couldn't stop. And so I found a little switch in my head, like I did after that docker had abused me. And I just turned my head off from the rest of my body. And that went on for years. But strangely enough, I survived by remembering the good things. And in the book, later on, there was an amazing twist of fate, years later, where I came across this man. Incredible.
You used the word queer there, which of course was a word that was used of the time. And you explain partway through the book, well, I've used that word, and then now then you start using the word gay, which is the word that we would use now, and most people, whenever they see the word queer, it's almost got the same connotations as some of the sort of racial words which we can't use on the radio now, and you wouldn't actually be able to use the word queer apart from the context that you use. How important is language in this? Because there is no law that we can't offend people, but language can offend, particularly about sexuality.
Yes, language is extremely powerful. When I see acts of brutality, and when, as it happened during my time at EastEnders, bricks came through my window and Paul's window, it's words written or words said that someone collects and uses to justify what they're doing. But language is also essential in your history, so that you show your evolution. And again, something I refer to in the book, that when my dad said queer, it had a harsh sound to it. And when I would say to someone, are you queer? It was completely different, because it was our only way of associating. And then when, that wonderful period of the mid-1960s, when I was 15 years old and I came back from being on tour and, as they used to say, from touring the provinces and being introduced to gay bars. Well, they weren't gay bars. They were rooms in the back of pubs. First of all, I shouldn't have been there because the age for drinking was 21. And you were surrounded by older actors on the tour who would tell you that you were a criminal, that you were illegal, and that eventually you would be locked up, you would be blackmailed. And you talk about language, that seeps in, and it has a deep whether you like it or not, it has a deep psychological effect. But then I don't want to paint a dark picture, because you then find a way of ascending above that. And so when we got back to the West End, and this lovely guy Iain, I refer to him as a brawling queer, because Iain and I had a fight, and he kicked me between the legs, and I thought, someone who kicks like that needs to be your friend. And he brought me back to London, and I went to my first ever gay bar, where all they served was coffee and Coca-Cola, called Le Douce in Darby Street. It was paradise. Boys of my own age, some who I'd witnessed from going to stage schools like me, who'd been young actors, who had daren't come out to one another. There we were, and there we could be ourselves.
It was a liberation, wasn't it?
For me, yes.
Obviously, I wasn't around then, but the way I imagine the Soho of the mid-1960s to be is exactly how you describe it in the book. And to actually realise that there were lots of people like you was liberating, I guess.
Yes, but also to realise that world you had in the West End had to be left in the West End. That world in the West End could be shattered by someone from your neighbourhood accidentally walking into that bar or that club and seeing you there. But the camaraderie between us gay boys on the street and the working women along Berwick Street. We used to know one another by first name terms, and if some of the older predatory men were just too persistent, we used to go over to the Subway, the lesbian club, and get the assistance of the lesbians to come and beat up one of the gay men. They loved beating up a queer, especially an old one, but again, there was no age of consent. This was 1966. It wasn't partially decriminalised until 1967. And then I was in a relationship with a wonderful man, 8 years my senior. I was 16. He was 24. And so even when it was partially decriminalised, our relationship was still criminal.
Getting lots of texts and emails from people. This is one from Darren in Langford, who says, I remember this man on TV. What a man. His story is inspirational. He should be proud.
Thank you, Darren.
There's a lot of, I won't read them all out, but there's a lot of others like that. Let's talk a little bit more about your acting career, because, it's interesting. You talk a lot about being in Oliver, which I didn't know you were in, but you've done a lot of things in your acting career. But of course, the one thing that people always remember is your role as Colin Russell in EastEnders. Does that, in a way, slightly frustrate you because people tend not to sort of talk about all the other things?
No. I mean, the films with people like Elizabeth Taylor and David Hemmings.
Name drop.
Well, if a name's worth dropping, drop it heavily,
exactly.
Somebody said.
Yes.
No, because I'm immensely proud of what we did in EastEnders, and I never expected, because of what happened between me and Julia Smith, the producer, I never ever expected that I'd go into that show. So when they asked me to the studio...
Explain that.
Well, she and I had worked together on a BBC series called Angels about nursing.
I remember.
And I played the first ever male nurse. And I stood up to Julia when...
I was a male nurse once.
No, were you really? Yep. See, all these comparisons. We've got failing 11 pluses, male nurses, although I only played it.
I did it.
And so Julia and I, she gave me some notes as the producer, and I said, no, put these through the director. And then the next day she rang me and she said, I've looked at the episodes and sadly there are no more for you. So I was sacked. And so when she asked me into her office at the BBC, and there was Tony Warren there, the co-creator, And they said, look, there's this part, and we've been trying to cast a straight actor. And my ears pricked up. And she told me the storylines, and she said, and he's gay. And I knew, because of the depiction of AIDS and HIV as the gay plague at that time, the stigmatization, the prejudice in the popular press and amongst politicians of both major parties, that I knew anyone who took on this part was going to really get it in the neck. And so going into that show at that time, the courage of the BBC, I asked Paul and I were together then in an illegal relationship because he wasn't then 21. There was 13 years difference between us. And Paul said, yeah, do it. My mum and dad said, yeah, do it. My dad said, nothing like the East End, go and do it. And before I was even on the show, I was revealed to the British public with a headline of the Sun, which said EastEnders. And what we did in that show, that first gay kiss, the depiction of Colin, my character, with Gary, played by Barry Howes, as being ordinary men, was, I think, crucial in changing attitudes. Because, first of all, they got to know Colin for 3 months before they found out. He developed relationships with people that they knew in that show. And I was going into their homes, so they knew me and they understood me. And Dot's reaction against me, they laughed at, and then they sympathised with Colin. But so we went on an amazing journey, and this is why for me it's pivotal. During that time, as you know, the then government, Margaret Thatcher's government, brought in the first anti-lesbian and gay law in 100 years. And there was going to be a march against this. Section 28, it was called. And I just knew I had to be on that march. I didn't tell Paul. I didn't tell anyone. I asked June Brown if she'd help me get time off. And June and I from different political parties. And she went, oh, Mike, dear, don't go on that march, dear, don't. You'll get arrested. I said, I won't get arrested, June, honest. She helped me get on that march. And Iain, I knew if I hadn't gone on that march, I couldn't have looked myself in the face again. I couldn't have been playing a gay man and an openly gay man and said, no, that fight is nothing to do with me. And I campaigned alongside many other wonderful people, like Ian McKellen. And when we failed to stop that law, that's when we said, right, let's form an organisation so that another Section 28 doesn't happen again. Because what I realised was that politicians of all parties wanted the arguments as to why they shouldn't do it. And I have to mention two brilliant Conservative MPs, Robin Squire and John Bowis, who defied the whip and would not vote in favour of Section 28, and their careers
Just to
suffered.
explain to people who maybe aren't aware of what was happening then, it was essentially a law that said that teachers in particular were not allowed to promote homosexuality in the classroom. And that word promote it could be interpreted in many different ways. And a lot of people interpret it, well, that means you can't even mention it.
And in fact... I
don't think was the intention.
No. And in fact, it was so badly drafted. If they drafted it as clearly as you've said, they might have got more sympathy. But it said, a local authority shall not promote homosexuality. Well, we said, okay, a local authority has concert halls. Can it therefore not do the works of Tchaikovsky? Is it promoting by doing that? Can it not do the works, the bisexual sonnets of Shakespeare? Do we take books off library shelves? So the connotations were fairly wide, and so doing that and forming Stonewall with others led me on the path into politics, because all of my passion was being directed into that, and that's why I decided to leave EastEnders.
Did you get any flack from the BBC for going on that march?
No. Amazingly, the BBC never once took me aside and said, don't do that. I noticed that the number of episodes that I was appearing in was decreasing, but there was a wonderful moment when Mike Reed, who played Frank Butcher, people will remember him as Frank Butcher, a wonderful comedian, and he ad-libbed in a scene, and it was kept in and it went out, and I walked into the Queen Vic and he went, here he comes, clause 28. and it was it was the marriage of real life and soap together. And but I was asked or told by a gay actress. She came up to me and she said, "You've done enough. Think of your career." And I said, "Well, if I have to think of my career before doing what I think I should be doing, then I haven't got a career that's worth it." And my career didn't suffer. I mean, I knew I had to leave EastEnders and then go on and do other things. And that was how I ended up in politics. But again, I never thought, when they asked me, would I run for the internal nomination? My immediate reaction to Margaret McDonough, who subsequently became the first woman General Secretary, I said, "Margaret, I'm busy sanding the floor. No, I don't want to go into politics." And Paul came in, and I recounted it to him, and he said, "Why not? Why not?" And so I ran for the nomination, didn't get it, came a close second, and then continued acting after I sanded the floor.
Lots of people saying, "I'm listening and I'm going to buy the book," but Alan in Peterborough isn't. He says, "Will there be an audio version of Michael's book available?" Yes, there is.
Yes, and
and you read it.
Yeah, I read it, and I had a great time. I realised once again how difficult it is earning money as a voiceover artist or an actor. But I do all of the voices, including my approximations of people like Ian McKellen and Elizabeth Taylor and David Hockney and J.B. Priestley and June Brown, of course.
I interviewed June Brown here about 6 years ago.
Was she still smoking?
It was an amazing interview. Unfortunately, I don't think we've got it anymore. Otherwise, I'd put it out again. But I absolutely loved her.
I adore June, and we're still.
She plays Dot Cotton, for those of you who don't know.
Mrs. Dorothy Cotton.
And she's still in EastEnders, I think, at the age of 90, goodness knows what.
Yes, she is 90, goodness knows what. And I think June has said she's taking Mike, I'm taking a rest, dear. She phoned me when I was in Brixton. "Oh, where are you, dear?" I said, "I'm in Brixton." "Oh, someone has to be."
Right. I want to turn to your political career, because you were a very well-known actor. You just mentioned, the Labour Party were courting you. How did you actually get to be an elected politician?
Well, the first time round it was everybody else's idea. And as I said, I didn't go to university. I left school really at the age of 12. And so I didn't come from that careerist attitude to politics. And then when it came around, the nomination came around for the 1999 European elections, lots of people, including Paul, said, "Come on, go for it. You don't sit in the armchair and lecture the television. Get out there." And so that's how it happened. I had to win the internal nomination. It was a really tough battle, because the party was using the process to get rid of a lot of MEPs who proved problematic to the Blair years in opposition, and then as we were approaching government. And so when I was selected, I got the votes of London, but they put me up in the West Midlands. So I had people up in the West Midlands say, "Well, you might be a nice guy, but we didn't vote for you, so we don't want you." But the brilliant thing is,
I get into so much trouble if I do a Brummie accent.
Oh, really?
But you can get away with it.
But you see, they did me a favour, because I had to go up there, and I had to prove to them that I would begin to understand the issues. And if it had been London, I think it was Clive Soley, who was the chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party. He said, "Someone's done you a favour." He said, "Because, your heart wants to represent where you were born, but your head should tell you everybody around you knows where the bodies are buried." And I had 15 brilliant years looking after the West Midlands. I started there were 3 Labour MEPs up there, and I ended up as the only one. But from Stoke-on-Trent right the way down to south of Birmingham, right the way across, it was a privilege to represent those people and that heart of England and the diverse industries, trying to stop the ceramics industries being hit by China joining the WTO, and I managed to get an amendment through. But working on simple things, working to deliver, but also realising that European politics was never going to get good coverage, because all governments of all persuasions, and I said this to Tony Blair, I said, "You need to write us into the national script so that when you stand up at the dispatch box, you say, we're bringing forward these measures based on the agreement that we've reached with others and the work of our members of the European Parliament. And that way we belong in the national script. But all governments have claimed any good that's come, or perceived as being good, as their own. And anything that might be unpopular, initially, something that springs to mind, vehicle emissions, when it first came in, they said, we have to do this. And I think so long as you say, right, I've got a job of work to do, where I'm never going to get applauded for it, but it is the work that must speak for itself. You just get on with it. And actually, I think in politics particularly, if you go into politics in order to be liked, you're mad at the beginning of the process rather than driven mad by the process.
What are the similarities between acting and being in politics? Because, I mean, you've got to have an ego to be an actor. You've got to be an extrovert in many ways, although I think there are actually quite a lot of shy actors, just as, I mean, I would describe myself as quite shy, which nobody ever believes, because I think when you sit in front of a microphone talking to the nation every night, how can you be shy? But a lot of politicians are shy as well. What did you get as much enjoyment out of politics as you did as you did in acting?
Yes, the similarities are absolutely that you need, first of all, to have an imagination. You have to imagine, what if you were in that situation? What if you were in those shoes? Crucial. And then the ability to communicate your vision, what you see, what you feel, and communication skills are crucial. Interestingly, a lot of people in so-called show business and in politics are quite shy. They're quite introverted, but the profession gives them an excuse to be extrovert, and you get support. The difference between politics, for me, and acting, is in acting there's greater camaraderie, because you have a focus. You've got to get that play on. You've got to get it done. There's no ifs, no buts. Churchill got it absolutely right, which is, the opposition may be in front of you, but the enemy's behind you on your own benches, because your advance threatens the mediocre. And often there isn't that focus unless you're in government. And then even when you're in government, there's the understudy who would rather be playing that part than seeing you being the Secretary of State.
Were you comfortable in politics?
Yes, and I still am, I think, for two reasons. In the European Parliament and in the House of Lords, no one party has a majority. So you have to work cross-party. You have to work with other people. That's intellectually more satisfying. It's intellectually more demanding. And I enjoy bringing forward, like in 2017, an amendment to the Policing and Crime Act to widen the disregards and pardons for historical homosexual crimes, and working with people across parties so that the government says, we'll work with you, and they adopt the amendment.
So when you hear politicians like Laura Pidcock saying she couldn't possibly be a friend with a Tory, or even Rebecca Long-Bailey, who said something vaguely similar a couple of weeks ago, I mean, it must frustrate you, because the successful people in politics do actually build cross-party alliances.
Well, of course, and actually to shut yourself out from friendship with people who have a different approach to achieving in life is to shut yourself out from the family of humanity. There are people in the Labour Party who were elected with me who I couldn't bear to be in the room with them. That was my problem. But then the notion that somehow belonging to a party makes you better than others, and that you can't get on because you're in different parties, I don't accept that tribalism. Because it's the same old argument. If you accept that, they say, well, all heterosexual people are good, and all non-heterosexual people aren't good. Look at the individual. And that's what I'm interested in. And Malcolm Harbour, lovely Malcolm Harbour, who was a Conservative MEP, I bumped into him at Westminster with Penny, his wife, and we stood there chatting, and Dominic Grieve came out, and I went out to try and support Dominic in the election. And there I was with this little group of Conservatives. And Malcolm said, oh, you better go because people will worry about you. I said, no, I'm all right. It's the person that matters. And actually developing a relationship with another politician means they'll more readily listen to something that might otherwise be alien. That's how we won the battle on LGBT issues, not by saying there's only one party that can deal with it. We won the argument with the major parties, because if there's only one party that can defend your rights, when that party's in opposition, so are your rights.
We're with Michael Cashman talking about his book, one of them, From Albert Square to Parliament Square. Michael, you stood down as an MEP in 2014. Given what's happened since then, do you kind of wish you hadn't?
No. I interestingly, when I went in 1999, I said I'd only do 10 years, and I didn't keep my word to Paul. So, and by 15 years, and there was the big explosion, quite rightly, of the expenses scandal in Westminster, and we were all tainted. And I felt it was time to let go, to make room for other people, but time for me to spend more time with Paul, because being in Brussels 3 days a week, I'd come home and all I wanted to do was to be a vegetable on the sofa, and he used to say, come on, I want to go out. And so I took that decision to step down, and I didn't regret it. I loved my time there, and I loved doing so many things with so many other different countries, but secret in life is to let go, and I'm pleased I did.
And you left to spend more time with Paul, but sadly that wasn't to be.
Yes, in 2011, he and I were on a trip. Actually, there's a lovely story. We were in Papua New Guinea, where homosexuality was illegal, and Paul, always at his own expense, used to come with me where I went. And we got a call from our head of protocol saying, Eamon, he said the Prime Minister's office wants to know why Mrs. Cashman isn't joining the spouses' trips. And I said, what did you say, Eamon? He said, I said, Mrs. Cashman is actually Mr. Paul Cartingham. and so he was always a bit of a curiosity item wherever we went. And we were in South Africa, and he found a little bump on his nose, and he said it won't go. And it turned out to be a really aggressive cancer. They only see one of these in every 3 million. And that happened in 2011, focused my mind that cancer had come into our life as a teacher. It taught us a lesson, and I now wanted it to go. And he got through it with amazing courage. He became my hero and my warrior. Because before that, if you had a headache, you used to say, "Oh, I'm going to have a stroke." But to see him battle with that, and so he got through it. And he had the operations, and he had to deal with people looking at him because of the disfigurement. That can be quite fierce. And then it suddenly came back. We were in Turkey at our old farmhouse, and he ended up in hospital, and they discovered it. The secondaries had come onto the pleural sac of the heart. Typical of Paul, that was always his one weak spot, his heart. And his oncologist in London said, no, absolutely not. The secondaries never occur there. And when we came back, it was confirmed. And then within 3 weeks, he died. I was with him in the Royal Marsden, and I knew the night before. I knew that he was dying. I knew we were looking at hours. And he gave me the most amazing gift, because the following morning, Aisha Maya, the consultant, came in, and she said, Paul, and he was quite high on morphine. She said, Paul, you always said you didn't want any doom and gloom. He used to say, no doom and gloom. And he said, yeah, no doom and gloom. And she said, well, I told you I'd be honest with you, and we've reached the point where we can do no more. We'll be with you for as long as it takes, all of us, but I can do no more. And when she left, he looked at me, and he said, well, now we know. Now we know. And then he went, and I'm ready. I'm ready. And that, Iain, was the most priceless gift, because he told me he could face death, that I could throw away my fears of what he was fearing, and of course you never do. And I was there right the way through to the end, and it was the end of 31 brilliant years and the beginning of something different, the beginning of endings. And that's one of the reasons I've written the book, because it was through our love that this man took his time to show me that I could be loved, that I was worthy of being loved, that I didn't have to be abused. And this young man who was wise beyond his years. And he died 4 days before I went into the House of Lords. And even during his last few hours, he was trying to plan how he could get to the House of Lords with medical support. And the kindness and the nobility and the compassion that I was shown when I went in is beyond description. But we did some amazing things during that period, don't get me wrong. And I celebrate his life every single day, and I miss him every single day. But the funny thing is, when I have wonderful news, he would be able to turn it into the most amazing thing. And I was always worried about the future. Coming from that poverty, he did too. He had a tough upbringing in Liverpool and then in Newark. And we met at the Butlins Grand Hotel in Scarborough. Barbara Windsor introduced us. And
you didn't get much gayer than that.
You don't. She said at one point, we'd been together about 15 years. She said, "Ian, what is it with you two?" I said, "What?" She said, "You've been together all these years. I've had 2 husbands since then." And we had a difficult relationship. We had to work at it. We developed, I pushed him away, and we developed an open relationship. And that isn't easy. No relationship is. And I suppose the reason I've addressed this relationship is I'm trying to say there is no one size fits all. Whatever works for you, choose it, but realize you have to work at it every single day, and there is never enough time. And the only thing that sustains you, the only thing that gets me through, is the love that he shared with me and that I shared with him. Means that there's double love left that's changed me and gets me through those awful days. And I think, why isn't he here? I want to share this brilliant news. Doing the book and all of that, he would be in his element. But the story I was going to say about me always being careful with money, because I used to think about the future, and he used to say, spend it, and in mock horror I would cover my ears and scream. Typical Labour, you said.
But clearly, this is 5-6 years on now, and you still clearly think about him a huge amount. And you said anything that you do is you kind of still want to share it.
Yes.
Do you think you'll always that will always be with you?
Yes, it will always be with me. And I battle with my depression because of his absence. But I'd rather battle with that than not have had him around and changed my life in such a brilliant way. And so I've had to battle with my demons. I subsumed myself in drink and depression for a while, and got out of it, because otherwise, what's the point of wallowing in self-pity? I could always impersonate him, and I hear him in my head saying, "Come on, get yourself out, enjoy yourself, spend it."
Well, I think that is a magnificent way to end. I kind of wish we'd go on a bit, but I think we better not. Michael, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I suspect everybody that's listening is going to buy your book.
Well, that's wonderful. But thank you, Ian, for giving me the space and the time. And it's been beautiful just to have this chat.
Well, Michael's book is called One of Them, From Albert Square to Parliament Square. It's got an endorsement from Joe Brand on the cover. Someone said on Twitter, when I said you were coming on, they'd seen the cover and they said, if Joe Brand's endorsing it, I'm not going to read it. And I thought, what a small-minded thing to say. But she says it's beautifully written, funny, and moving. Well, I haven't completed it yet, but it is a book that I am going to finish reading, because I think that the pages that I've read so far are absolutely fantastic. It's published in hardback by Bloomsbury at a very cheap price, I think, of $18.99, because it is quite a long book, and I have to say it's one of the best book covers I've seen this year. Well, I say this year, it's only a month old, but
David Mann produced that, and I said, David, thank you for presenting me to the world so beautifully.
well, he's done you proud. Michael, thank you.
Thank you.